Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session of .NET Conf Day 2. We got Ben over Skype to talk about DevOps flow with ASP.NET Core, EF Core, TFS 2017, VSTS. It sounds like we got a bunch of stuff going on. How's it going, Ben?
Pretty good. Been a busy day.
So, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome.
All right. Okay, so like the man said, this is DevOps with ASP.NET Core, EF Core, and TFS 2017. I'm Benjamin Day, owner of Benjamin Day Consulting, based out of Brookline, Massachusetts, which is basically Boston. Right now, I happen to be at Pluralsight Live in Salt Lake City, Utah, so I'm presenting at a conference from within a conference. It's just taking a few minutes away to do this talk right here. I do consulting and training, a lot of stuff with Scrum, DevOps, TFS, software architecture, yada, yada, yada. I'm a Microsoft MVP, Pluralsight author, Scrum.org trainer. So Scrum.org is Ken Schwaber's company. Ken Schwaber is one of the two co-inventors of the Scrum process. Teach a bunch of different classes through them. If you're looking for Scrum training, give me a call. I'm at BenDay on Twitter, and www.benday.com is my website. So while we're talking about Pluralsight stuff, I've got a new course coming. It should be dropping within the next week or 2 weeks. It is DevOps Skills for Developers with Visual Studio and TFS 2017. Basically, it's the 9-hour version of this talk. So we're going to do a lot of stuff in that I won't have time to talk about right now. So anyway, on with the show. So I am guessing that some of you are probably feeling a little busy at work. Maybe a little run down. You feel like you got 67 trillion things going on. Just, going around putting out fires, trying to do 67,000 things, right? We're busy. Well, that's not necessarily an awesome thing. And when I hear developers or teams talk about being too busy, I start to think about productivity versus waste. So there's this dude, Gerald Weinberg. He wrote this book called Quality Software Management, Volume 1, System Thinking. And it's kind of a barn burner of a book. And he went out and did a bunch of studies to see how productive developers were depending on whether they were trying to work on one task or up to 5 simultaneous tasks. So what he found was if you had one task, you can be 100% productive on that task. So that makes sense, right? One thing, you can focus on just that one thing. If you had 2 tasks, you could spend 40% of your time on one, 40% of your time on another, and then you'd get 20% waste. 3 tasks, it's 20% on each with 40% waste. 4 tasks, 10% on each, 60% waste. And it doesn't get a whole lot better when you get down to 5 tasks, when you're spending 5% on each task and 75% waste. Now, if you think about what that actually means with 75% waste, if you're working Monday through Friday, that means that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday are totally gone. Most of Thursday is gone, and you're productive on Friday. When you're trying to do 5 simultaneous tasks, you're going to feel too busy, and you're losing most of your effectiveness off to context switching. So, science proves it. Humans are terrible at multitasking. So when you try to do 5 simultaneous things or however many simultaneous things, you just aren't good at any of them. You lose your focus. You're constantly shifting in and out of what you're paying attention to. So what we're going to try to do with DevOps is we're going to try to eliminate that. We're going to try to cut down on the multitasking and be productive by trying to eliminate distractions. Now, when I start thinking about software development, I think that our industry has kind of a big problem. Like one of the biggest problems we have in our industry is the name of our industry. Because when you think software development industry, you start thinking about software developers, which makes sense. I mean, we're a good chunk of what the industry is about. But if you write your code on your laptop or your workstation and then you check it into version control, it compiles on your box, checks into version control, that's fine. That's great, but you're not really done. Until you've actually delivered that software to someone so that they can actually use it, it's not very useful, and you're not going to start capturing any business value from it. So What I think would make more sense is if we start thinking about our industry as a software delivery industry as opposed to the software development industry. Now, when you switch into that mindset, you start thinking about all the stuff that happens holistically about delivering software, like from coming up with our project plans, from test plans, test case management, software architecture, writing the code, testing the code, getting it scripted out, ready to be deployed onto servers, getting servers stood up, talking to operations people, monitoring of our stuff once it's been deployed. There's a ton of stuff that happens that goes into making sure our application is delivered. So once you start thinking about that, that starts getting you towards more of a holistic DevOps mindset. So in that DevOps mindset, I want you to start thinking about stuff that slows you down. So any of those distractions that push you more towards 5 simultaneous tasks as opposed to 1 simultaneous task, start thinking about that. So anything that slows you down, automate it. Anything that's painful or annoying, automate it. Like all the stuff that you don't want to do, automate it. Which actually, going back to this slide for a second, like whenever, like we've probably had project managers that do this. They want you to do something that is unfun, so they either bring donuts or pizza. So whatever they're trying to get you to do when they bring pizza, you probably want to try to automate that thing. That's an indication they're trying to make you do something that you don't want to do, that's no fun, and they're trying to bribe you into doing it. So whenever free pizza shows up, that's usually an indication that you need to automate something in DevOps. So what is this whole DevOps thing? I define it as DevOps is a mindset plus a set of practices that focuses on automation. So that mindset is that we want to have a full end-to-end way of easily delivering software from development through to operations and have that be as seamless as possible. And we're going to do that largely by leaning on automation. So why DevOps? Well, the more stuff that we can automate, the more we minimize the distractions, and the more that we make delivery of our software and deployment of our software easy. Also, if it wasn't clear already, DevOps, Dev is the development side, Ops is the operations side. So over the last, say, 15 years of Agile and Scrum, we've generally gotten pretty good at getting ready to deliver software. So we get done working software ready, but then we've got to actually hand it off to somebody to make it get deployed onto servers. And that sort of air gap between development and ops is a handoff, and whenever you have handoffs, it slows things down. So why DevOps? Minimize distractions, make delivery and deployment easy. Now, as a hint, if you haven't figured this out already, you want to have more frequent releases. So releasing your software more often is going to be fantastic, and DevOps is going to help you to do that. So if delivery and deployment is easy, it means that it's not a big deal to do a release. So hopefully also when you do a release, it doesn't have too much human involvement. So, and if delivery and deployment is easy, it means that you can do releases more often. And if delivery and deployment is easy, you can spend less time focusing on delivery and releasing your software and more time focusing on your real job of writing and actually delivering done working software. Make sense? All right. So one of the things, this is sort of a snooty, fancy pants word that we use in DevOps, batch size. So going for smaller, more frequently, Going for smaller, more frequent releases is something called a small batch size. So batch size is important to think about in DevOps. And one of the ways that I sort of try to explain it to people is, let's say you're trying to eat that, 8-layer sandwich, and you're trying to eat that in a single bite. That's kind of that semi-annual or annual, that big bang release model that we've kind of been doing traditionally in the industry for a long time. And that's a large batch size. So we're trying to deliver a ton of features at one time, and that's just a lot of stuff to deliver and handle at one time. As opposed to if we do more frequent releases, we're talking daily, weekly releases. That gets us into small batch size. So sort of thinking about trying to eat a stack of 8 sandwiches in a single bite, as opposed to trying to pop a single spoonful of whatever the heck is in that spoon. Looks kind of delicious, right? All right. Anyway, clip art. Yay. So thinking about DevOps and releases, the smaller, more frequent releases are a ton easier to manage because there's a whole lot less to worry about. If you're trying to deploy 30 new features and all the requisite database updates that go with it, that's 30 things you have to worry are working or not working. Also, that's 30 things you need to get feedback from your customers on. And you know that when you ask for feedback from your customers and you say, here's 30 things I want feedback on, they're going to maybe look at 2 or 3 until you get to production. And then they're going to tell you that the other 28 items that were in that release, they don't like them and they're angry and you have to fix stuff right away. Any surprises are bad. Surprise, bad. But if you're shipping smaller releases that just have 1 or 2 features in them, it's a lot easier to manage, less to worry about, less stuff for people to give you feedback on. Also, it gives you a smaller surface area for your mistakes. So you're going to make mistakes. DevOps is not going to make that go away. The idea here is that if you're not shipping 30 features simultaneously and instead you're only shipping 2 or 3, if those features don't work for some reason, it's a lot easier to roll back 1 or 2 features than it is to try to roll back 30. All right, enough talking. Well, enough talk. I'm going to keep talking, actually. I've got 55 minutes to fill. Let's stop with the theoretical stuff and let's hop into talking about DevOps, specifically for ASP.NET Core and EF Core. I promise I will get to demos in a bit. All right, so DevOps goals. This is goals for any technology that I write my stuff in, but specifically, let's think about it in terms of EF Core and ASP.NET Core. So I want to make sure that my stuff is version controlled. I want to make sure that my stuff is automated, and I want to make sure that stuff is repeatable. So version controlled, hopefully that makes sense. Getting your code into TFS or Git under TFS, whatever you're going to use, making sure that you've got that stuff version controlled so that you know what you have. Now, putting it in version control puts you within reach of automated builds and being able to do automated testing as part of your automated builds. And additionally, with this whole repeatable thing, doing it automated build plus version controlled stuff going into the automated builds means that you can theoretically go and recreate a build that you did 6 weeks ago. And, well, that means that if you need to roll back, you've got a prayer of rolling stuff back. So with these things that are version controlled, automated, and repeatable, what we're getting towards now with sort of a DevOps mindset is not only just doing our code, but also starting to automate and script out what our hosting environment looks like. So start thinking about stuff like Docker, Azure Resource Manager templates, and things like that, containers. Another thing that I'm thinking about for DevOps goals is I never, ever, 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 ever want anyone to deploy from a developer workstation. I just don't trust it. We've all heard of the works on my box problem. Works on my machine, doesn't work anywhere else. Well, when you're deploying from a developer workstation, you're just basically asking for the works on my box problem. So this don't do a deploy from a developer workstation means that nice right-click deploy that you've got inside of Visual Studio, I think that is largely incompatible with DevOps. It's great, it's handy, but if you want that version-controlled, repeatable, automated way of doing deployments, that right-click deploy out of Visual Studio, it's not really happening. It's not great. One of the reasons why is that that's super manual, because someone is going in, opening up Visual Studio, doing a build, doing a right-click, and doing a deploy. And the chances that someone does something a little bit different, and now that causes problems, maybe it's not likely, but it's much, much more possible than if you have, say, an automated build doing that. So what I'd like to see happening instead is deploying from TFS build and ideally also from TFS release management pipelines. So checklist for ASP.NET Core, EF Core, DevOps. 1, code is under version control. 2, database schema and database changes, database updates are under version control. Automated tests, unit tests, integration tests, UI tests like Selenium, those are there, they exist, and they help you to identify if your app is working or not working. We're doing all this stuff from an automated build, and if we're going this far, going to automated releases and automated deployments. So I think a really big important thing that a lot of teams forget about is taking care of their database. So in DevOps, don't forget the database. I'm guessing that almost every application that you use and you develop eventually ends up with a database somewhere. And if you've got a database, you need to have a way to version control the schema, store procedures, functions, primary keys, what the columns are, what your indexes are, all that fun stuff. That all should be under version control, because if it's not under version control, you really can't automate it. If it's in version control, you can do automated build and deploy your database schemas. And I think that there are 2 big approaches that exist in Visual Studio. There's actually a third. I'll come to that in a second. The first 2 that I use a lot, SQL Server Data Tools, SSDT. These are database projects, SQL Server projects in Visual Studio. That helps you to describe exactly what's in your database and what's not in your database, gives you tools for deployments. You also have the option of entity framework migrations. This is what I'm going to focus on in the rest of this talk, is how do you use entity framework migrations with TFS build to do DevOps. Now the third one that I don't have listed here are the Redgate tools. So there are Redgate tools that come along with Visual Studio. There's a free version and there's also a paid version. They're all great, but I'm going to focus on entity framework migrations for right now. All right. Now, a tip that I've kind of stolen and sort of added some stuff onto, stole this from Scott Hanselman. I saw him speak in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, maybe about a year ago, and he was talking about .NET Core and how it's really important to learn how everything works on the command line. And his point, which is actually a really great point, is that if you understand how things work on the command line, then when things go wrong, you can understand how to debug them. You kind of have a feeling for where different things all fit together. Now for DevOps, with automated release management and automated builds, it's really helpful to know how to do everything for the command line, not just for debugging, but because most of the stuff you're going to do is going to be batch scripting or PowerShell scripting. It's almost everything in DevOps and automated builds comes down to calls you're going to make to a command line. So if you know how to do all this stuff with .NET Core and Entity Framework Core on the command line, you're in really great shape for automating your stuff in your DevOps build release pipelines. All right, so I'm going to take a quick drink of water, and next we're going to do a demo. All right, so demo, I'm going to start off with an existing solution, and we're going to do some stuff to use Entity Framework migrations inside of Entity Framework Core to manage our database schema. And my taskbar is hidden. Here we go. Okay, so I have created an empty solution. I just went down to the command line and I typed in .NET New and used one of the scaffold projects that are in there. Did a bunch of stuff, and I've added in some of my dependencies. So for .NET, for Entity Framework Core, I'm using the following NuGet packages. You're basically going to be working with Microsoft Entity Framework Core.design and .SQL Server. And I won't go too deeply into that stuff right now, but I've got a web project and I've got an API project. I think API project would be my my business objects, all my back-end code that backs up my ASP.NET user interface. And then I've also got an app settings.json, and this has a connection string inside of it. All right, so first off, if you're going to do Entity Framework Core, I'm going to come in here and create a DB context. So I'm just going to call it my DB context. So DB context, it's, if you're familiar with Entity Framework Classic, which is kind of a weird thing to call it, the Entity Framework we've had for a long time, not the core version. If you're familiar with that, DB context really hasn't changed all that much. If you're not familiar with Entity Framework, well, DB context is where you go for all your stuff. This is the center of how Entity Framework saves your entities into the database and loads it back and handles all your changes and all that kind of fun stuff. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to create a class that we're going to want to save into the database. We'll call it person. We'll have a property called ID. We'll have another property called first name and a final property called last name. Now, if you're wondering what I'm using to get all these nice little expansions, I'm using CodeRush. CodeRush is awesome. And let's see, I'm using CodeRush for Roslyn v17.1.7. All right, so we've got that in there, and that person class is pretty much good enough. I'm ready to go for that. I'm going to use a CodeRush refactoring called move type to file. We'll take that class and put it into its own C# file. I've got my DB context, and I'm just going to rename this file to match the type. So that just went over here and changed that from class1.cs to mydbcontext.cs. All right, so we've got our DB context, but it doesn't know anything about the person class. So let's add a DB set property. So DB set is a utility class that comes along with Entity Framework Core, and it just says this is a collection of things that we know about. And you can do link queries, and that'll call in the database and get stuff out, and you can add things into this collection and save them. And this is basically how you start working with person objects and person tables in the database. All right, so we've got this, and we need to do one more thing. Or actually, you know what? I'm going to come down to the command prompt and try something out. Go to the command line, developer command prompt. Puts me into the directory that has my APIs in it. And I'm going to type in .NET EF. .NET EF is the command line interface for Entity Framework Core. If you type in .NET EF on the command line and you get an error, that's an indication that you have not added a tools reference. So let's come over here and let's edit the csproj file from my API. And let's see, right down here, if you get that error, it means you need to add a .NET CLI tool reference that points to this NuGet package right here. So that NuGet package, Microsoft Entity Framework Core.tools.net, that is what gives us that command line interface for working with Entity Framework. Okay, so we've got that. Back down to the command prompt again. So what I'm going to do is I want to add a migration. So an Entity Framework Core migration is how we package up the changes that we want to deploy into the database. So I'm going to come down here. I'll say .NET EF migrations, add, and then I'm going to say initial migration. So initial migration meaning just setting up the database. We'll run this, and I believe this is going to cause an error. And it tells us that it is unable to create and it's telling us that it's having trouble newing up an instance of my DB context. And it says to add an implementation of iDesignTime DB context factory that goes to the type of my DB context. So what this class does is we'll provide a class that implements that interface, and this will be how Entity Framework .NET Core tools on the command line we'll know how to new up instances of our DB context in order to do this entity framework core migration stuff. All right, so we'll come back over here, and I'm going to add one of those design time data context factories. All right, so I'm not going to take you through tons of this code here, but basically I'm doing an implementation that is of iDesignTime DB context factory that points us back at my DB context. And then we've got this class with the really unwieldy name of my DB context DesignTime DB context factory. So anytime you see the word factory, it means that that's a class that knows how to create other classes. All right, I'm going to extract this into its own file. And if we scroll down just a little bit, really the interesting stuff that's happening here is that we're creating an instance of configuration builder that goes and looks for an app settings.json, which it'll find this one right here in our API project. Give it a couple options, including being able to grab connection strings off of environment variables. I'm not going to demo that right now, but we're going to read it out of app settings.json, and the connection string I want is named default. Let me just hop over into app settings.json for a second. So basically, almost everything that the DB context factory class is going to do is knowing how to read our app settings.json, get the connection string, and then new up an instance of our DB context. All right, so let's build this. Hopefully that should build. Looking pretty good so far. All right, that passed. So let's come back over here and let's rerun this .NET EF migrations add initial migration. Okay, so it ran, and now in our project, we've got a new folder over here called migrations, and we've got a bunch of different files inside that folder. So since we gave it the name of initial migration, we get classes that follow that naming pattern. So in a migration, we got an up method and a down method. This is auto-generated for us. We just run that command, it creates it for us. So up is for deploying this migration. So in this case, it's going to create a table. The table's name is person, and it's got an ID field, a first name field, and a last name field. And it's got a primary key of PK persons that points at the ID field. So pretty cool. Generates this, and when we run the deploy this migration, it'll deploy these changes. The down is for rolling back this migration. If we ever want to go backwards and undo our change, it'll come in and drop the table persons. Okay? Cool. So at that point, let's come back down and let's deploy this into the database. Actually, before I do that, let's go into SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to refresh my list of databases. And right now there is, let's see, what database are we going to be using? We're looking to use a database called My Database Name. Very creatively named. Actually, let's call it .NET Conf 2017. All right, so we've got that in there. And there is no database called .NET Conf 2017. So back down onto the command prompt. Now we want to deploy our changes off to the database. And we're going to do .NET EF database update. This will run. Hopefully it won't error out. We can see that it is talking through the MyDesignTime DB context factory class, because I've got some debugging calls that I put in there that write out to console. And it says that it's applied the migration. So let's come back over to SQL Server Management Studio, refresh this, and now we've got .NET Conf 2017. And we get a couple different tables in here. One is our person table that has ID, first name, and last name in it, just like we'd expect. And then our EF migrations history table is what Entity Framework Migrations uses to decide whether or not it has deployed certain migrations. So I know this is kind of a small font in here, but that is the name of our migration. So every time we run a migration against our database, it adds a record into this table, and that's how it makes sure that it doesn't run the same migration twice. All right. So at that point, we basically have scripted out our database. So we have an initial migration that'll set up our database. We've got our way of deploying our changes, and we can add this into version control. So I've already marked it as add to version control. So I'll come into changes. I'm using Git and TFS. So I'll say added initial migration. I'm going to say commit all and sync, which will just automatically push that up to Team Foundation Server. And there you go. That is pushed up to SQL Server. Excuse me. That is pushed up to TFS. Now, this is great for just our initial migration, but now let's say we need to make some changes to what we're doing. So let's come into person, and let's say that we need to add an email address column to this. So we'll add a new one. We'll say email address. Let's add status in here as well. So we just added 2 different fields into that. And let's add another class. Let's call it note. Nothing too fancy. ID, and then we'll give it a property called note text. Move that to its own file. So we've added that new note class, so we need to map that into our DB context. So we'll add another DB set. Tie that up to note. So we get a notes property right there. We'll save that. Let's make sure it builds. And if it builds, we'll go down and add another migration into our project. Come down here. We'll say .NET EF migrations, add person, email, and notes. Descriptive. You're trying to go for a descriptive name. Add that in there. That runs. And now over here in our migrations folder, we've got person, email, and notes. So what it's saying in our up, so for applying this, it says add a column called email address, add a column called status. Both of those go into the person table. And then we create a brand new table called notes that has an ID and note text field. So pretty cool right there. All right, so now we can go deploy that into the database by running .NET EF database update. All right, so that's applied that migration. Let's go look at it inside of SQL Server Management Studio. We now have a notes table. We have a persons table. And we've got our new columns, which are email address and status. So right there, we've done some modifications to our database, modifications to our entities, added a new migration, and that is part of our project. So at this point, we can take this and we can commit our changes. We'll say added new fields to person, added note entity. Commit all and sync, pushes that up to TFS, and now we've got our database changes all in there. All right. Coming back into slides, because we all love slides. So let's do a quick summary of what I've talked about so far with EF Core and EF Core migrations. So the NuGet packages we care about, if we want to talk to SQL Server from Entity Framework, we're going to do Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. If we want to do database updates, aka migrations, we're going to want Microsoft Entity Framework Core.Design. You'll also probably want Entity Framework Core.Design and .design.SQL Server. I don't think I have that in the slides anywhere. If you want to reverse engineer an existing SQL Server database, you can do that using a command called scaffold, which I didn't demo. And you'll need that design DLL right there to reverse engineer an existing database. To enable that .NET EF command, you're going to have to edit the CSproj file and add a .NET CLI tool reference that points at that NuGet package right there. So if you go down to the command prompt and you type in .NET EF and you get an error, that's an indication that you haven't added that tool reference. And you add the tool reference by going in and adding that item group with the .NET CLI tool reference element inside of it. Make sure that you point it at the right version of the DLL. Excuse me, the right version of the NuGet package. That's right there. EF migrations, that's version control for Entity Framework Core, an entity framework. Doing migrations from the command line. If you need to add or remove a migration, it's going to be .NET EF migrations add, give it the name of the migration, or migrations remove. If you want to deploy an update, it's going to be .NET EF database update, and that'll deploy the database changes into the database. All right, so some things you'll need for EF Core. You needed to have that DB context, and that's the starting point for all the stuff you're going to do in your database. All your database operations, your saves, retrieves, your updates, deployment of Entity Framework migrations, and that is in that namespace right there. So create a class that extends from that DB context class. You're good to go. You'll need a design time DB context factory of type T that points back at your DB context. This is going to handle creating instances of your DB context for doing the database migrations. And that is in that namespace that I'm not going to attempt to read right now. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about hosting ASP.NET Core on IIS before I start getting into some automated build and automated deploy demos. Now, the structure of ASP.NET Core versus ASP.NET Regular, the kind we've been using for a long time, it's got a different project structure. And while you'll see things that are familiar, like web config and DLLs, you need to install this little thing right here. So you're going to install something called the .NET Core Windows Server Hosting Bundle. If you don't install this and you go deploying your ASP.NET Core application on IIS and you try to run it, you're going to get a 500 error. And it's not going to give you a whole lot of information. It's just going to say, I got nothing, which is pretty much what a 500 error says. If you're doing ASP.NET Core 1.star, you're going to follow this link. These slides will be posted up either on Channel 9 or on my blog, probably both. So you don't have to memorize this right now. But that's the URL for the .NET Core 1.star version. For 2.star, it's got a slightly more friendly URL. If you need to do hosting of both of them, you have to install both of them. It's pretty fun. But the installation, it's a 80 meg download, run it. It's going to take you about 4 seconds to install it. It's really quick. It's painless. But this is the thing that allows you to host ASP.NET Core on IIS. All right. Another drink of water. And let's talk about TFS build and release. Or actually, let's just do demos. Let's do that instead. All right. Let's open up Chrome. All right. So coming in, this is Team Foundation Server, so the web interface for TFS, and this should have the history that has the stuff that I added in. So we did the demos of adding new fields to person, initial migrations in there. Sort of seems like we're missing something. Let's go back to Visual Studio for a second. Is there anything I didn't check in? Nope, that looks good. All right, I'm just going to go with it. Okay, so we've got the code inside of TFS. We can go through it. go looking at it, we've got our migrations, we've got our app settings.json, all its stuff is in here. So now let's do an automated build. So we'll come over to build and release, say build, and we'll create a new definition. So definition means build definition. And since we are doing ASP.NET Core applications, I'm going to use ASP.NET Core Preview as a template. I'm not really sure why it still says Preview, but that's the one you want. So it's just going to give us the starting point for our build template. Click Apply, and the first thing you're going to want to do is rename this. So let's give it a good name. We'll say default build. All right. And I will save this right away. And what you'll recognize is that this has all the same steps that you would do if you're trying to build and deploy, if you're trying to build a .NET Core application on the command prompt. So first thing you would do would be .NET restore. That'll restore all your NuGet packages, all your dependencies. So that's step one. Step two, do a build. That'll be a .NET build command on the command line, and that will compile any of the CSproj files that you've got inside of that source control repository. Tests. So if you've got unit tests, it'll try to run them. And then the last thing is it's going to try to do a .NET publish. Now, by default, this tries to do some stuff that's helpful for you, where it tries to publish your web projects for you. I find that it's not really very helpful because what you get out of the other end is a zipped up version of the output of your web project. And that's fine if you're only doing build, but if you're doing releases, it starts to become a problem. So let's come down here, and I'm just going to snag that. Let's go over to publish, and let's see. I forget exactly what the name of my project is, but I'm going to say build anything with the word web in it. So that should pick up my web project. And down here, one of the arguments is -- output, and it's -- output to the build artifact staging directory. So anything that shows up in the artifact staging directory is going to get published by this next step called publish artifact. Basically, this will take the compiled code, publish it up to TFS so we can use it in a release. So I'm going to come and create a folder called for deploy inside there just to keep everything nice and clean. Now, at this point, this should be ready to run. So I'm going to say save and queue, and hopefully this will actually work. So first thing it does is it tries to contact a build agent. So I'm doing this inside of Hyper-V. I've got a full TFS set up inside of Hyper-V with build servers and other servers I'm going to do deployments onto. So it starts off, it does a restore, does a get of the sources, downloads the source code, restores my NuGet packages. It's going to do a build. And as you can see, this is basically showing you what's happening on the command line, because this is just a really fancy way of generating a bunch of command line calls. So it's doing the build step right now. That should complete in just a moment. Then it'll run my tests, which you don't really have any tests right now, which is very bad. You should definitely have tests. It's super fun to watch this, isn't it? Just me filling time while we wait for TFS to do the build. This is like the worst radio show of all time. All right, cool. It ran and the build succeeded. So it went through, it published our artifacts, basically published the output of our build. And if we come up here, we can see we've got a build with a build number on it. And if we click on it, it takes us into the overview of our build. Down here, it shows us what our associated changes are. So basically, what are the changes? What are the recent commits that went into this build? And we also have this thing that says artifacts. And if we click on explore, there's someone at my hotel room door. That is perfect timing. We open up the drop directory. We've got our for deploy directory in there, and we've got webui.zip, and that's not what we wanted. I think I forgot to save something. Anyway, like all good demos, I'm going to go and cut over to one that is already completed that worked just fine. Come over into this one that I ran earlier today, go into artifacts, go to explore. We've got the drop directory, for deploy, and then we get benday.net conf.webui, and we've got the output of what we did in our build. So basically, this is the ready to deploy version of our web project. Okay, so back to that other one for just a second, just because I'm a glutton for punishment and I want to just keep making demo errors while I'm being watched by a bunch of people. Let's come in here for just a second. We're back into the output of this, and we see we've got this button right here called release. So if we click on this, it says we don't have a release definition that is tied back to this build. So a release inside of Team Foundation Server is how we take the output of builds and deploy it off to various environments. So I'm going to say, yes, I want to create a release definition, and it gives us a whole bunch of places to start from. So Python, Kubernetes, PHP, Node, Azure Service Fabric, all kinds of stuff that we can start from. But because we're cool, we're going to start from empty. So we say empty, and then the next thing it says, what build do we want to attach to? So I'm going to attach to the build we just created. And then we have this option right here that says continuous deployment. So continuous deployment means that this release will try to deploy the latest output of the latest build every single time that the build runs. So this is a great way to automatically deploy your stuff. As long, if you check in your code and the build runs and it passes your tests and it's good, well, why not just deploy right now? So remember I was talking about in DevOps having small batch size, small releases. Well, you don't necessarily have to release to production every time, but it is really handy to be able to deploy to test environments or QA environments. And having continuous deployment as one of your options in your release is really awesome. So I'm going to create that release definition, and that drops me into this empty release definition. So I'll call this demo release 1. We'll save it, and that's good for right now. So I'm going to hop over and show you a release that I've already created for that build that succeeded. So this is default build in a slightly different team project. I'll click on releases. And while I was developing this demo, I released 16 times. Took a little while to get it ready. We can see that it's deployed to the dev environment. We can click on logs and we can see all the stuff that it did. Now let's go over and look at the actual definition. So we'll come to default release, click on edit. Let me close that down. And this is going to deploy to our dev environment. So I'm using a handful of tasks that I've created that are available in the marketplace. So if you go up to marketplace.visualstudio.com, you can find this add-in that I've created, this extension. It's called Build and Release Tools. Search for that, and you can get all this cool stuff right here. Install it into your TFS, and you've got some handy things. So the reason that I created those add-ins for Team Foundation Server is that there's a lot of things that I found really tedious for deploying ASP.NET Core applications and Entity Framework Core applications, and this just helps me out. So what I'm going to do is I basically scripted out the things that I would do to deploy my application off to a dev environment. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my app settings.json and update the connection string. So this is probably a worse practice of hard coding a connection string directly into here. Usually you'd probably add that in as a variable. I talk about how to do that in my new Pluralsight course, so check that out. So what I'm doing is I point this at appsettings.json. So you go into that for deploy directory, choose the appsettings.json that I'm going to use when we're going off to production. Edit the default connection string to be that value, and then we're good. Next thing we're going to want to do is to deploy our EF core migrations. Now, there's some tricky stuff that happens with EF core migrations. So when you're trying to deploy EF core migrations, it really is a lot easier to deploy them if you have the source code. But let's go back in and look at the output that we're trying to deploy. Do you see any source code? No. Okay, so you can deploy EF core migrations using just DLLs, but it's a little bit hard. I love the team. The team is great. I think this is just one of the things that fell off their backlog. Hopefully this is something they're going to add in and make easier soon. But in the meantime, I've got this deploy EF core migrations task that I created. So if you want to add that in, you say add task, go to utility, go down a little bit. And if you've installed my extension for TFS, you'll get this step right here that you can add into your release or into your build. And then you get these other ones that are available to you as well to do some other stuff. Okay, so that second step will be deploying our EF core migrations. And then the final thing I want to do is I want to copy my files off to a share that hosts my web application. So in this case, this is going to be deploying off to a web server called Demo17 Web1 and put it into the .NET Conf-dev directory. Now, this thing right here, this third step, what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm editing my web config file that has already been deployed, and I'm just changing it. So if you're familiar with the Unix command or Linux command touch just does something that slightly modifies a file. Now, anytime you modify web config, that unloads your app inside of IIS and releases any locked files. So I like to do this just to make sure I don't lock any files so that when I run this next step, which does the copy, everything runs just fine. So we've got that. Now, if we want to do a release, we can say create release, and it'll say which build we want to deploy. I'm just going to choose the latest, and that'll go and run and deploy our application. But I'm going to skip ahead and show you what I've already deployed. Now, with that, this is not a really fancy ASP.NET Core application, but I went through and fully deployed the ASP.NET Core app that we were working with, that we did our builds on, that we did our releases on, we did our EF Core migrations on, and that's all going into an actual database. So through automated build, test, release, we've gone and deployed this off to an actual web server, and we're able to run the application. So at that point, I think I'm pretty much running out of time. Let me just wrap up. So our ASP.NET Core, EF Core DevOps checklist. 1, make sure your code is under version control. Hopefully that is not anything exotic and that you're all sold on version control. Next, make sure your database schema and your database changes are under version control. So if you're using EF Core, a great way to do that is EF Core migrations. If you're not using EF Core, check out SQL Server Data Tools. They're also a really great option for managing that. So get your schema and your changes under version control so you can start deploying them. If you've got automated tests, and you should have automated tests, run them from your automated build. So from your automated build, compile your stuff, run your tests, make sure it all comes together. And then finally, use automated release and deployment to actually deploy your EF Core migrations and your ASP.NET Core app off to whatever server you're using. So, any last questions? or any questions at all.
Yes, Ben, we got one question, and the question is, how is the insertion of the DB context and DB context factory done in such a timely manner? What are the shortcuts?
Can you read that one more time?
Yep. How is the insertion of the DB context and DB context factory done in such a timely manner? What are the shortcuts?
Huh. You mean what are the shortcuts I'm using inside of Visual Studio? So there are CodeRush templates that I wrote that I would be happy to share with somebody else. I'll give you the quick view of it right now, just
perfect
to show you what I'm doing.
Yeah, if you have this code or wherever you're going to share.
Yep.
You
can.
Yeah,
I'll share out my my list of CodeRush templates as well.
Okay.
Actually, I should write a blog post on that.
Cool.
So what I was doing is I was typing in dbcf, and that gave me my context factory.
Oh, nice.
And that's all that code right there. dbs gives me my database set, or excuse me, my db set, and dbc was for creating the data context.
Cool. Yeah, maybe you can put like GIS out on GitHub so people can take a look at it.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Cool.
Right.
Well, that's it. We don't have any more questions. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you are at another conference, so you took time away from that conference to speak at our conference. So thank you very much for doing that.
Hey, no problem. Thanks very much for the time. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you later.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much. Well,
right, see ya.
Yep, see ya. But all right, everyone, that wraps up day 2 of .NET Conf, and I'm actually going to invite my partner in crime here, Beth Massey, to come in. So we'll give her a second here. Hey, Beth.
Hey.
How's it going?
How's it going?
Great.
My back is killing me.
Oh, is
How
it?
about you?
Yes. I mean, sitting down and doing everything that we need to do is just, it's a lot of work.
It's been awesome. Actually, we're on mute.
You're muted.
I'm
You're muted. Can you hear Beth now?
This is why I'm not on camera, because I don't know how to use the things. So yeah, thanks everybody for watching. We had such a great interaction today on Twitter. I can't believe how many people were excited. We got so many great questions. I didn't realize that we have had more questions than any other conference.
Yeah, so a little FYI, Beth and I actually been sitting behind our computers since all day yesterday, all day today. Every time you put a question in on Channel 9, we're the ones who are sending it to the right tracks. So we have to look at them.
We have teleprompters and people are reading them, so everything's live. That's the benefit of doing this live, is so we can answer your questions.
It's literally like the Matrix out there. We're just moving stuff left and right.
Yeah. So what do we got up for tomorrow?
So tomorrow is day 3, or beginner day. And that's the best part, because we literally have 2 tracks for whether you want to focus on C# and or web and mobile. So on the C# track, which we're calling .NET Fundamentals, we have in Getting Started with .NET. So we have Scott Hanselman and Kathleen Dollard taking 2 hours in the morning, showing you how to do the CLI, all the tooling involved around it, which is going to be pretty great. We also, after that, we have 2 hours of C# training by Bill Wagner.
Awesome. That's going to be great.
Yeah,
Bill's great. So if you're basically like learning programming, he would be really good to teach C#. So.
And then we're going to have a little bit of Razor Pages, an introduction to that, and then we're going to finish up with F#. So a lot of great content there. Now, if you already know C# and you want to kind of get your skills a little more up to speed on the web and mobile side, we have the ASP.NET team coming in, teaching you ASP.NET Core, web APIs, security, a ton of great content.
So wait, we're going to have Scott Hanselman, Dan Roth, Maria, like the ASP.NET team,
exactly.
right?
Oh yeah,
okay,
it's the real people, the people who are building the stuff
Yeah.
with us. And at the end, we're going to have Xamarin. So we have Xamarin University doing training for us, pretty much for like 4 hours straight.
Great, those guys are awesome.
Oh yeah, it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, having multiple tracks is the first time. We're literally 16 sessions a day of .NET going through this conference, and it's been pretty fantastic.
Yes,
actually.
tiring, but fantastic.
Tiring and fantastic. So, so look at the hashtag .NETConf and tune in tomorrow. All right, guys?
All right, thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.
Woo! Yeah!
See you, go on. Have a great night. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.